Shalom. I'm Jonathan Feldstein, president of the Genesis 123 Foundation. I want to express my sincere thanks to 10 from the Nations for inviting me to share some comments, and especially for making it the priority that it is to stand with Israel and the Jewish people, specifically at this time and specifically on this day, Tisha B'Av, the day when we commemorate numerous calamities that have befallen us and our people over millennia. Sadly, this is all the more meaningful this year because Israel needs that much more comfort and encouragement. The truth is, at the beginning of the current war, on the rare occasion that I would venture out of the house and into Jerusalem, I felt like I was living out pages of Lamentations. Jerusalem was desolate. It was eerie. Things were scary in general and sad. And they still are sad. And there's a lot of grief for all of us to go around after 10 months, more than 1,500 dead, thousands injured physically, and countless people scarred emotionally and psychologically. And let's not forget 115 hostages still held in captivity by Hamas in Gaza. Today, there's still a war raging, and Israelis are still mourning, suffering the consequences of personal and national trauma. I believe these are traumas that for most of us will remain with us for the rest of our lives, even my grandchildren. While October 7th was not on Tisha B'Av, when we remember so many other calamities, arguably this year, we have not experienced a calamity in Israel of this magnitude since the year 70, when the Second Temple was destroyed. And arguably, we are living in a season that brings us closer to the experiences that Jews in Israel had at that time than any time since. As much as there were many factors on our side that allowed the multi-system failure to take place, and not projecting, preparing for, preventing, or fighting back sooner and with greater strength, so too are the depths of our grief, mourning, and trauma. But make no mistake, the actions committed are by the Iranian-backed Islamist terror group Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and the Iranian Islamic regime itself. Nevertheless, in this season of introspection, and on Tisha B'Av specifically, Jews look inward and follow a tradition of recognizing that we have a responsibility, at least to learn from the evil that's threatening us, if not reflecting on our own responsibility in these events taking place to begin with. It's uncomfortable to think, much less articulate in general, today especially, as we commemorate a day of national mourning of disasters that have taken place over millennia. Jews understand that while the Romans and Babylonians physically destroyed the temples, it was our disunity, baseless hatred, that allowed the evil ones to succeed. So take some of that responsibility. Some take some of that responsibility even further. But certainly, before October 7th, we were in a state of tremendous disunity. I don't know if and how that contributed directly or indirectly to the massacre of October 7th. And while I don't for a second remove the actual blame from the Islamic terrorists who planned and committed the atrocities, it's legitimate to be introspective at least. It's even helpful. Recently, I met a very religious and pious man in one of the Gaza border communities that was most devastated on the October 7th massacre. Of course, he blamed the terrorists for the massacre, the inhuman rape, sexual mutilation, beheading, burning people alive, executing children in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children, and for the kidnapping of people from more than 40 nations, including many from his own community. For him, it wasn't theoretical. It literally took place in his own backyard. But he also said that had it not been for our tremendous disunity before October 7th, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Maybe. But he articulated the opposite as well. This is important, that when we are together, when we are unified and focused, nothing can defeat us. That's at least a positive message, that while we cannot change the sins of others, we can and must be accountable to ourselves. You, 10 from the nations, and Christians around the world take that to a higher level of unity by addressing your culpability or the culpability of the church in general and seeking to repair that. The taking of responsibility now is a very hard thing to hear, especially now. But maybe this year we feel more like the Jews of 2,500 years ago and 2,000 years ago, respectively, when they witnessed the temple's destruction, the horrors that took place. Maybe it's too fresh and too raw even to consider, but maybe knowing the past, we can have the awareness and realization to build from this and look to a future where we are indeed unified. But here we are on Tisha B'Av, 2024, living in the shadows of the most horrific thing that's happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust, a calamity that's not behind us by far. The inescapable reality makes conversations this year, more than any other year in eight decades, focus on something that's real, not theoretical or in the distant past. Before, it would have been common to mention the things that happened in which we remember, but not things that we are in the midst of living. I don't ever recall something so present in our lives that's impacted so many of us, Jews and Christians, all over the world. So these are the things that we have to discuss. But before I continue, let's review why Tisha B'Av is so significant, and therefore why what you're doing is so significant. On the biblical calendar, it's the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, when there are no shortage of horrible things that have happened to the Jewish people over the millennia that fill many volumes. Throughout the history, on the 9th of Av, usually an unusually large number of events have happened to the Jewish people that are nothing short of calamitous. Some of these are intuitive, and some represent the beginning or conclusion of historical events that were calamitous then and still have a lasting impact today. What are some of the events that we're mourning? First, of course, the destruction of the first and second temples by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE and the Romans in the year 70. Both took place on Tisha B'Av. That's coincidence enough to give significance to the day. Before that, Tisha B'Av is the day on which 10 of the 12 spies returned to Moses and the Jewish people with a bad report about the land. In the year 135, the Romans crushed the Bar Kokhba revolution, destroying the city of Beitar, killing over 500,000 Jews. In the year 1096, the First Crusade officially began, killing 10,000 Jews in its first month and destroying Jewish communities in France and the Rhineland. In 1290, the Jews were expelled from England. In 1306, the Jews were expelled from France. In 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain. In 1914, Germany entered World War I, which caused a massive upheaval in European Jewry and whose aftermath led to World War II and the Holocaust. In 1941, the Nazi commander Himmler formally received approval for what's called the final solution, marking the beginning of the systematic murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, almost 1/3 of the Jewish population. Implementing the final solution, on July 23rd, 1942, mass deportations began from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. And in 1994, much more recently, the Iranian bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, which killed 85 and injured 300. And most recently, we experienced the 2005 unilateral Israeli disengagement from Gaza, one that surely in part led to Hamas taking control in 2007 and the massacre we saw 10 months ago. Each of these was a calamity on its own and also set the stage for many worse things to happen as a result. For instance, Maybe if Israel had not withdrawn from Gaza in 2005, we would not have been facing the mourning we are today. My point is not to get political, but to underscore the consequences and impact that each of these have. So we mourn nationally and as a people, not just Jews in Israel, but Jews all around the world. It's a day of mourning, fasting, refraining from adorning oneself, from marital relations, and even from studying Torah. Thanks to the nation's ninth of Av, in recent years, our mourning has been shared by Christians all around the world as well. But it's not only today, on the ninth of Av, but for the past 10 months that we're feeling the support of Christians from around the world. Countless Christians have been standing with us, praying for us, grieving with us, and even losing sleep like us. In Judaism, comforting mourners is a binding obligation. But it's hard to be in a place of comforting others as a people when you're one of the people mourning yourself. It's like being a tree in the woods. Since on Tisha B'Av, we all mourn, for centuries or longer, it's as if we've mourned alone, with no comfort from outside, just grief, remembering, and praying that there will be no more national calamities to continue to have to mourn. That's changed. This year, the vivid mourning and fear among Jews worldwide has increased and is palpably more real as we are still at war. While it's not in its first year, the nation's ninth of Av activities are all the more significant this year. The October 7th massacre took place on a festive holiday, but 10 months later, we're still in deep mourning and also fearful that it may yet get worse before it gets better. That's what makes your participation so much more significant this year. Too many Israelis and Jews feel very much alone, not incorrectly. Your mourning with us is sincere, it's heartfelt, and it makes an impact. You show us that we are not alone. You fill a role of comforting the mourners, the Jewish people, but you do so as part of the extended family, yet from within, not as strangers or distant neighbors. It's as if Ruth herself were to have said to Naomi, "When you mourn, I will mourn." By doing so, you turn the tide of history from the Jewish people being alone to Jews and Christians coming together. Just by your actions, you are participating in what I call applied repentance, not just words or prayers, by meaningful, visible, tangible actions. And you necessarily make Jews consider our history vis-a-vis the church, under which so many crimes against the Jewish people were carried out. If we're mourning events of 2,000 and 2,500 years ago, of course we remember the crimes committed against us by people professing to be Christians in Christian Europe. Jews carry lots of baggage from millennia of persecution, much of which by Christians, people like you, who profess their faith in Jesus. As shocking and dismaying as that is for you, and I know it is, it's something that's inborn with most of us. Through your actions, you're changing how we look at you as well. That's huge. You also change how other Christians look at their faith and the Jewish people. You set an example for other Christians. It's a very rude and uncomfortable awakening for true Christians today to realize that the church carried out so many crimes against the Jewish people in the name of Jesus, undermining his own injunction that when you do it to the least of these, my brethren, he says, you do it to me. It must pain him immeasurably to see people over the centuries professing their faith in him, yet committing atrocities against his people. Redemption can happen any moment, overnight, like now. Okay, not yet. But each of us have the opportunity to hasten that through our actions individually. How much more powerful when we do that together. As my friend who I met on the Gaza border said, when we're unified, we're unstoppable. He meant Jews. I don't mean just Jews. I mean Jews and Christians together. Now that's powerful and that's unstoppable. And I believe that that can hasten the redemption in the way that we all pray for. I have one more thought relating to our situation this year and why 10 from the nations and your participating in Tisha B'Av together with us is so important. If we look at all of the list of calamities that happened to the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av, two major themes occur, being the destruction of the temples and the Holocaust. As much as the destruction of the first temple was horrible, it was rebuilt 70 years later. It didn't diminish the suffering of those who experienced that loss and exile, but it served to repair a vast breach in our reality as a people and the ability for the Jews to return to and restore worship in Jerusalem. While the destruction lived in our memory then and still does, arguably 70 years after the temple was rebuilt, the Jews of Jerusalem were less focused or sensitive to the loss that had taken place 140 years earlier. That's the nature of loss and grief. It never goes away, even if it diminishes. In recent years, the Holocaust was either the worst or second worst thing that's happened to the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple. Which is worse is open for debate. Other than the dehumanization of the Jewish people and mass murder of 1/3 of us, one of the most glaring realities that led to the Holocaust, and which we have internalized since, is that we were basically alone. Few Jews in Europe had any positive association with Christians or the church in general. Yes, they were good neighbors, they were righteous Gentiles who saved Jews, and most of them were Christian. But that was a drop in the bucket, both numerically and theologically. More often than not, individual churches and the church in general bred anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was, if you will, natural, and the Holocaust did not just happen in a vacuum. So there was very good reason for us to feel alone. That distrust among Jews for Christians has lingered for the past generations. What's changed is that as Israel turned 50 and 60 and 70, and as Jerusalem was reunited, we have begun to see a gradual yet growing shift in expression and display of actual support for Israel and the Jewish people coming from Christians. It's something that's unprecedented in history. And even though many Jews might still not trust Christians, for those of us who exist in this space of building bridges and understanding that Christians and the church today are not synonymous with anti-Semitism, discrimination, and worse. And more Jews are seeing and understanding that true Christians express their faith through support of and solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people. And more Christians are seeing that as well. And now, almost the same amount of time after the Holocaust ended as the amount of time it took to rebuild the temple, that your support is that which repairs the vast breach culminating in the Holocaust of our feeling alone, so alone in the world. Today, when we mourn collectively for so many things, and you are both mourning with us and comforting us, know that it's not just something empirically good and theologically sound as a rejection of anti-Semitism and replacement theology, but something that brings us progressively closer to redemption. And in comforting the Jewish people, you affirm what true Christians are and ought to be about. You help repair the breach that's almost as old as the mourning for the Second Temple and bring us closer than ever to Tisha B'Av being observed from a day of fasting as we do today to feasting as I pray we will do soon. May God bless you and your loved ones as you continue to bless Israel.